Hi, I'm Chris Konya.
And I'm Elisa Peebles, and today we're going to talk about the fall of our empire and the hope in our plurality.
Quick introduction just for us. I'm a principal at Sylvain. We're a strategy and design consultancy focused primarily on brand and innovation to provoke progress in the intersection of culture and commerce.
And I'm a creative strategist, artist, and consultant. And I'd like to take a minute just to acknowledge the fact that we are filming this today on Lenape-Hoking, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape people. I offer my respect, gratitude, as well as an acknowledgement of debt owed to the original caretakers of this land, their ancestors, and their descendants who continue to feel the effects of previous and ongoing displacement.
And so, I want to start by looking back at the Islamic Golden Age. It may seem random, but it had some similarities to where we are now.
It does seem
From
random.
600, I know, it feels random. From 622 to 1258 AD, Middle Eastern societies flourished by an influx of various thinkers and cultures, all coming together to share ideas. Islamic scientific insights were translated into Persian, Arabic, Indian languages, Turkish, and Armenian. And while the movement toward cultural understanding was centered in Baghdad, it spanned from Spain to India. And during that time, Muslims, Jews, and Christians were all free to mingle and exchange ideas. And as a result, these cultures saw great advancement in astronomy, medicine, physics, art, architecture, and mathematics, including the invention of modern algebra. The key to all of this was a sense of openness. Openness is literally a lack of restriction. And when we think of it in this context, it's really a mindset of welcoming and sharing differing perspectives. The Guardian published that living in diverse societies is like taking a daily run. It constantly challenges our social perception and keeps the mind fit, agile, and adaptive. Whether it be neurological, cultural, or other, openness and exposure to different perspectives drives growth. Make no mistake, openness leads to advancement. That mindset of openness ultimately dictates the real benefit of diversity into our day-to-day lives and in our society. Without openness, diversity really means nothing. And equally, the opposite of openness, insularity, has caused great societies across history to wither and collapse. For example, during the Great Vanishing, Aristotle and Epicurus' works, Plato's Academy, and the Greek writings were all destroyed in a time that ushered in the Dark Ages and marked an economic, intellectual, and cultural decline across Europe. And so we see that great openness leads to advancement and insularity leads to decline.
I really like how you say that without openness, diversity means nothing. And I kind of want to pull it back further to talk about the ways in which the foundational structure of society can influence how open it is and what it does with its diversity. Because you can have a society that's very diverse, but not very open. Take ours, for example. We are structured on this binary of exclusive insularity and conditional tolerance based on the concept of a singular, dominant ideal national identity. This is because our society was created out of a project of empire, more specifically, a project of settler colonialism, which then fueled the development of an imperial empire. So settler colonialism is a form of colonization that removes indigenous peoples and ways of life from a land and replaces them with a new settler society, which then goes on to exploit and extract from that land to build capital, over time accumulating a political and economic dominance that extends across borders and that is maintained and protected by certain social structures, ideologies, and a militarized force used to control internal and external forces that can impact the continuity of the new system. One of those factors that can impact the system is people. The system has to figure out what to deal with all of those folks whose land that it's stolen or the people that it's enslaved or imported as cheap labor in order to build its capital. On the other side, it also has to figure out who gets to inherit and benefit from that capital and who gets to be put in charge to keep the system going. Thus, people get shuffled into all these different boxes depending on the roles that the settler colonial empire needs them to play. The system's ideology demarcates who's seen as superior or inferior, civilized or savage, intelligent or unintelligent, and so on and so forth. Those on the dominant side of things become representatives of that ideal national identity, which is then privileged and held as the norm so that the empire can continue to operate even when the people within it start to change. There can be diversity, but it's kept as non-threatening as possible. The US can pride itself as being a melting pot, but only center and privilege still one ideal citizen body. We all know what I'm talking about here. Look, my mom is older than the Voting Rights Act. Queer and trans Americans still live without federally mandated or protected equal rights. And the governor of Colorado just repealed a state law that made it legal to murder Native Americans who would not give up their land this past August. Regardless of the optics, we are still ruled by a singular identity and how much or how little we fit it.
Whew. Today, that singular identity is eroding. We're a country reaching our greatest level of diversity. In 2032, working class America will become a majority POC. Over 1 million adults in the US currently identify as non-binary, and today, 1 in 4 US adults have some kind of disability. And in 2045, our white majority will become a minority. But what's important to note is that this is not simply a majority to minority story. Instead of a new majority, we will become a country made up of multiple intersectional minorities. And while that may seem wild, a shared culture that looks a lot like openness is already cropping up. In the South, people are cooking up Vietnamese Cajun food as a new culinary movement. Recently, Ariana Grande became the only artist in YouTube's top 10 who was a native English speaker. And weighted blankets, which were originally made for people on the spectrum, are now being sold at Costco to bring comfort to a broader population.
Those are a lot of major changes.
It's pretty crazy when you think about it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so when you look at it, it starts to look like progress. And we certainly are in this era of social awakening. We won't begrudge ourselves that. But we still have a long way to go. Even today, what seems like openness only really confirms our dividedness. While we know that knowledge and expertise are primary predictors of performance and increase well beyond the years of 80 years old, an HBR study showed that over 2/3 of companies consider older age a competitive disadvantage. And when given an opportunity, we can't even elect a woman president, despite scientific evidence that the female body physiologically enables more consistent wins under stress. And in the wake of COVID and our current political divide, we are at even greater risk of faltering into insularity.
Yeah, I mean, we're also at risk of everything just completely falling apart. This singular identity that's at odds with our dynamic heterogeneity, it's not working, and the society that was meant to maintain is crumbling. I mean, just look around. We have gone through over 7 years of intensified protest, activism, and direct action, as well as grassroots activism, also seeing just constant headlines that are breaking all of these different types of scandals, forcing us to reconcile with the vast nature of abuse and toxic power dynamics across industries and social spheres. Climate catastrophes are now the new norm, and honestly, none of this shows any signs of slowing down. The empire is crumbling, it's falling apart, and all of the structures of oppression that were built to protect it, like these tight definitions of us and them and margins and center, are proving to be unsustainable and downright unhelpful. Alternatives are necessary. And in this web of crises, as the center begins to fold, the margins are calling. In fact, the margins are where the hope lies. Famed Jamaican-British cultural theorist Stuart Hall said just as much back in 1997, calling the rise of the margins the most profound cultural revolution to have ever occurred, threatening the old ways of the dominant regimes with their new kind of ingenuity. There's new subjects, new genders, new ethnicities, regions, and communities. There's power in all these previously silenced voices coming within earshot. And in many cases, these are the voices of people who may know or perhaps have always known alternatives for sustainable coexistence and mutual thriving. If we can position ourselves to listen, if we can practice openness, then we can integrate some of their thinking into our way of being, but this is exactly where the tension lies. In that very same essay, Hall warns us about the limitations of our conditional tolerance, the ways in which empire has made diversity as non-threatening as possible. We've turned difference into pleasure, into something exciting and exotic, into a commodity that can be bought and sold and experienced and controlled, but not seen as a source of power. The margins can keep calling as long as they stay exactly where they are.
This idea of margins calling, it feels a lot like pluralism to me. Pluralism is a term that has been around for a while. It's not the sheer fact of diversity alone, but is active engagement in that diversity. It is more than the mere tolerance of difference. It's the welcoming of openness to them. When you start to think about the term diversity, you realize it's anchored in etymology that comes from contrariety, contradiction, disagreement, and difference. But pluralism is anchored in understanding and sharing. What we yearn for is not diversity in and of itself, but a plurality that comes out of openness to our diversity. When we see plurality all around us in nature, we see it through symbiosis, where different organisms work together and even depend on one another to live. We see it in the mutualism between bees and flowers, clownfish and sea anemones, and oxpeckers and zebras. Lizzo was talking about plurality when she came out as body normative. She was saying it's not just about acknowledging a range of body types, but about mainstreaming the ability to see a person beyond their bodies, so that you don't even need a body positivity movement anymore. She was talking about creating new norms and bringing the fringe into a culture made by all. Jide Zeitlin of Tapestry was talking about a plurality when he said that until every employee can come and really feel as though they can bring their true selves to the job, you're not unlocking the potential of your workforce. Not until everyone feels that they can put a photo of their significant other on their desk or practice their prayers in time have we created a truly open culture. When we're talking about a plurality, we're talking about a new collective culture, not one that is made up of its core and its margins, one that redefines the entire culture through the diversity within it. We're talking about creating a new culture altogether, one that is defined by all of us.
Yeah, I love that idea of creating a new culture altogether. And I'm kind of curious to put it in the concept and conversation with decolonization, which is ideally the process that will get us to that new culture that you're talking about. To quote Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang's seminal essay of the same name, decolonization is not a metaphor. We can't afford for it to be. It is ultimately the end of colonization and the return of stolen land. However, within that process, there's a very necessary project of unsettling. And this project asks us to reimagine the way that we relate to the land and to each other. By unsettling the unsustainable and restrictive hierarchical power structures of empire, which operates under that one set of norms, we can then leverage a multiplicity of knowledge systems, values, and ways of being that ultimately can lead us away from these corrosive binaries and towards a nourishing mutuality. What does that look like? Yeah, it can definitely be kind of hard to imagine, but there are movements within the activist space that I think provide tangible examples of what this kind of pluralistic imagining and world building looks like in action. Decolonize This Place describes their work as being driven by and inspired by these freedom dreams versus a singular defined kind of outcome. Citing Audre Lorde's astute observation that there's no hierarchy in oppression, the group works to take these different causes that stretch across communities, borders, races, and ethnicities, and ultimately finds within them connections and potential points of solidarity. From these connections and points of solidarity, they build actions and communications that leave room for contradictions and differences, as well as linkages, kinship, and ultimately the formation of a new shared knowledge that can inform mutually beneficial liberation. This is represented well in one of their protest banners that reads, "When we breathe together." A recognition that despite our many different mouths and noses, we all breathe the same air. We all inhale hope and exhale what no longer serves us. And this process of collective regeneration keeps our individual movements alive, which thus then creates possibility for a shared future of mutual thriving. I really see this as a nice example of these concepts of plurality and openness coming to life, but there are also many examples of how activist endeavors that aren't quite rooted in openness fall short. I think in a pluralist society, we'd also recognize the need to let individual communities be author of their own stories and the experts of their futures. While the recent interest in the plight of Afghan women is coming from good intentions, so much of the narrative falls into the trope of Western saviorism, aligning the departure of the US's presence with the end of hope of progress for women's rights in the country. This completely ignores the decades and centuries-long legacies of Afghan women organizing throughout occupations and regimes, including the US's, as well as the current resistance efforts that we could be supporting if we weren't busy erasing them. And of course, pluralism would allow for diversity within the margins themselves and recognize the richness of specificity instead of leaning into reductionism that truly only benefits one side. I think Latinxgate is such a great example of this. This effort at wokeness has come across as ignorant at best and cultural imperialism at worst, stirring up harm and conflict along the way. And while there's efforts to replace it with Latine, a gender-neutral term that is actively used in Spanish-speaking countries, the larger problem was with the word itself. Latino is a concept that was created out of a US-specific set of contexts and needs, specifically a need to collapse differences into a singular identity. But those differences are very real and reflect very real racial, ethnic, and cultural realities. In the face of this new imposed language, communities and people that fall within this category are beginning to push back on their erasure.
When it comes to our community of brand and communications marketers, too often our tries at progress miss the mark. When we try to address social injustice, we've birthed woke washing. And by trying to help like minds find spaces to meet, we created echo chambers. And in all our DEI efforts, many of the real issues are still going unaddressed. Today, 53% of consumers think brands trust wash or aren't as committed to helping society as they claim. As an industry, we can't continue with the status quo. We have to change course. We have to question ourselves and our work in order to move forward. Diversity is not openness. And when I stop and look at the topics and the writings of today, I have to wonder, is our diversity exploitative? Are we using that word and that concept for selfish reasons rather than for the common good? And am I complicit in perpetuating that exploitation? We have to redefine our culture. As brand voices, we have an outsized influence in the stories our society tells and the norms we accept. We have to take responsibility to push for progress. How do we do that? I don't know. I don't believe there is one answer to that question, but today we have a few thoughts for where we can start.
Again, there's no one answer, and multiplicity does only make us stronger. But for now, here are 3 things to keep in mind and to do to help our clients innovate and stay culturally relevant while moving towards progress. First, realize that our audiences are about to become a diverse set of multiple minorities. And this will be difficult. It'll make it harder to find one meaningful and resonant insight across that multiplicity. In order to address these new audiences, well, we'll need to think more deeply about who we're speaking with. Actually, we'll need to start speaking with them instead of at them, first of all, and then we need to figure out how to better speak with them. We'll need to be more careful not to accidentally come across as pandering. One way to do that is by bringing in marginalized norms into our work and decentering dominant perspectives. An MIT scientist has said that if you design for and with those who are most marginalized, then you inevitably cover them and those who are in the majority. What he's saying is that to design for and with the marginalized is ultimately to design for our plurality. One team that did this well was the group who created the Nike Axos shoe. So the shoe was originally designed for people with cerebral palsy with no laces, but they did it so well that these shoes have broken out into the mainstream and are sold and used by all. While it was kind of a happy accident, the next time you receive a brief, any brief, think to yourself, how can I center marginalized perspectives in this core perspective in order to create a solution for all? Sometimes a way to do that is to literally decenter yourself from the process altogether and give the platform to the communities themselves. Last year, Beats gave us one of the most powerful advertisements that we've ever seen. And it wasn't just through kind of a lazy co-creation, but by actively handing over the reins to Black creators, specifically Lena Waithe and Melina Matsoukas. This led to a spot that authentically celebrates the incredibly rich diversity of the Black experience, something that is frequently lacking in representations of Blackness in film and television, and especially in advertisement. Take, for example, the moment in which we see Naomi Osaka staring at a painting of Toussaint Louverture. This is the first time I've seen her celebrated as not just a Black or African American woman, but as a Haitian woman. At the same time, this moment also speaks to the significance of the Haitian Revolution and Black Caribbean culture to the Black American experience, something that maybe seems like a nuance to kind of a general audience, but has actually been a large component of Black history since slavery. An action we can all take is to ask from whose POV early and often, and to respond with action. Recognize when there's an opportunity or a need to integrate marginalized norms or voices into the work, and to act on that need for integration. Even if, and especially when, that means decentering yourself as a means to decenter the dominant norms and biases that you have.
A second learning to highlight from today is that people are craving and already creating a shared culture. This multiplicity is already here culturally, and people want to interact and come together. So, as innovators influencing cultural conversations, it's up to us to push past existing conversations and become the creators of new conversations, to build brands that can become campfires for new groups to huddle and connect around, to create engagement, conversation, learning, and interaction that will become the foundation of our plurality.
It sounds really fun, actually.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I want to do it. I love NFTs as an example of this. This is actually a thing that I want to do. NFTs have brought so many disparate groups together. People from the art world, people in finance, people who want to invest but don't know how, people who choose cryptocurrencies, just plain curious people. The Bored Ape Yacht Club specifically has engaged their members and created that campfire by creating limited merch drops, Kennel Club NFTs, and an online graffiti board, and just announced the launch of a new token. At this point, NFT Twitter even has its own language. It's amazing, this new community that NFTs have created. And so, as brands, we have an opportunity to play the role of host, creating new spaces and tools that connect new communities, create new conversations, and find new ways to play together.
It's going to take a lot of Googling to sort of understand everything you just said, but I like the idea of creating spaces where people can come and play together. I think that's ultimately a win.
Cool.
Awesome. So another thing that we've talked about before, exoticization is the process of taking the differences that exist between people and commodifying them, versus leveraging them as a way to strengthen worldviews and world building. Now, you see this tension a lot in the food industry, where our desire to explore other cultures through our palates has led to a commodification of places and people where these foods come from, instead of learning from and creating equitable forms of exchange with these communities. One way to fix this is by shifting from methods of exoticization and appropriation towards practices of reckoning and doing equitable co-creation. The chocolate industry is rife with exploitations that must be confronted if there's any hopes at making it ethical. Kraft chocolate brand Cho set out to innovate chocolate as we know it, and along the way realized that this means innovating the way that it's made. Recognizing that most cacao farmers have never tasted the actual finished product of chocolate before, which is then limiting their ability to truly measure the quality of their crop and thus leaving them open to exploitation from importers and traders, Cho created a new sourcing program that builds tasting labs and processing facilities at origin, providing the farmers with the knowledge to not only consistently produce great cacao for Cho, but also for anyone else that they trade with. This strengthens these growers' ability to command better and fairer prices, and also builds other capacities that lead to more community sustainability. On the consumer end, Cho moved away from that superficial space-based marketing that over-exoticizes the culture where the chocolate comes from, and has instead integrated this tasting education into their packaging and product storytelling. Coming from our position in the world, it can feel intriguing to inject our products with a sense of adventure or exploration, but this does very little to create meaningful sites and moments of exchange and connection between the rich and powerful markets that we're importing our goods into and the communities that produce them that have been destabilized by exploitation. But this type of equitable exchange, these are the kind of things we need to build a stronger global community and ultimately better products. Instead of focusing on superficial or fantastical narratives, make your process something worth telling a story about.
The last point I'll make may seem contrarian, but it's really important to remember our individuality in all of this. Creating a collective culture doesn't mean losing our individuality. In fact, I think people will want to celebrate that individuality more and more as we become more and more of a shared culture. And when we do this, it will become important to be careful how we share that individuality. Not to alienate or push others away with it, but to honor that difference together by making it relatable and making it shared. I love the idea of the brand Black Girl Magic, because while not everyone feels they have Black Girl Magic, it's a concept that we can all get behind. These are women who are underdogs, fighting industry biases, creating a family of women, and inspiring others with products like She Can. They're making their individuality relatable and welcoming others into it. So ask yourself, how can I honor difference by making it relatable to all? And so today, we'll ask that we continue to celebrate our difference. Don't shut it down, but do it in a way that we can all get behind so that we can feel closer, even in our difference.
Yeah, awesome. In summary, we're at a critical juncture in our nation's progress. Our impending plurality has the potential to lead to an even new and greater and better progress for our country. And as brand stewards and influencers, we have a responsibility to push for openness and angle against insularity.
And so, in our brands and in our organizations, ask for from whose POV early and often, and always respond with action. Empower the many to play together. Make your process as great as your story, and revel in our individuality while recognizing our commonality.
Awesome.
I'm Konya.
I'm Elisa Peebles.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks.